Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today we're honored to speak to Dr. Suheil Lahir. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Suheil.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Glad to have you on. Dr. Suheil, thank you. Dr. Suheil Lahir has a master's in religious studies from Boston University and completed his PhD in Islamic studies at Harvard University. He has benefited from a number of teachers of traditional Islamic disciplines in the US and abroad, and has ijazas in Islamic theology, Islamic law, Hadith, and other subjects. He served as MIT's first Muslim chaplain from 1998 to 2014. As former academic dean at Fawaqih, an Arabic language institute, he made significant contributions to the classical Arabic curriculum. He has previously taught at a number of universities around the Boston area and currently serves as assistant professor of Islamic studies at the Boston Islamic Seminary. Today, Dr. Suheil is going to educate us about the concept of Tawātur. Now, Muslims frequently say that the Quran is transmitted to us via Mutawātir transmission. And we make a distinction between Mutawātir and Ahad Hadith and so on. But do all of us have a clear understanding of what Tawātur really signifies? And is it used differently across various Islamic disciplines? What does the Muslim theologian who discusses Tawātur mean the same thing as the Hadith scholar or Qur'anic sciences scholar? Moreover, is there something in common underlying the different uses of the word Tawātur across different Islamic disciplines? Inshallah, Dr. Suheil will be shedding light on these questions and more in his presentation. Dr. Suheil, whenever you're free, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Barakallahu Fik.
Yeah.
Share my screen. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd. Okay. So, Tawātur. I want to start first with a definition and some explanation of what Tawātur actually is, and then something on the history of Tawātur in Islamic thought, and then, of course, as Dr. Bassam pointed out.
Well, I'm not a doctor. You can just call me brother.
Ustad Bassam pointed out, two of the major applications of Tawātur are for Qur'anic sciences, in Qur'anic sciences and in Hadith sciences. So we will deal with each of those in turn. And then at the end, we will kind of summarize some important points.
Oh.
Okay, so we start with a definition and history. What is Tawātur? Tawātur is, simply put, a form of corroboration that results in certain knowledge. So corroboration increases our confidence in a piece of information. For example, if someone were to come into this Zoom room and tell us that, for example, a volcano has erupted in such and such place, we might believe him, we might not. Maybe he's lying, maybe he's mistaken, maybe he doesn't like me talking about Tawātur, so he wants me to stop. But now if a second person suddenly comes into the room and repeats the same information, then our confidence in this will be higher. But still, we might not be completely sure, because maybe these two people are both part of a conspiracy. Maybe they're both mistaken. Maybe this is fake news. But now if a third person, fourth person does the same, and then we decide to stop with this recording and to go out on the street, and then we meet many other people who are also telling us the same piece of information, then at some point we will become certain that this has to be true. There's no way that it can be false. So that is Tawātur. When we have enough corroboration that we become absolutely certain, at that point we say that that piece of information is now Mutawātir. This is the adjective, or we could say that this piece of information is conveyed by Tawātur, which is the noun. Okay, so a number of years ago, there was an article in the Tikkun journal by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf of California, and he was talking about the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, and he was warning Muslims not to deny this. As you know, may know, there are some Muslims who deny that this killing of Jews actually happened. So Sheikh Hamza, a major part of his argument to convince any skeptical Muslims skeptical of the Holocaust, he used a Tawātur-based reasoning. So essentially that the testimonies of tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors is a form of Tawātur. In other words, that it is inconceivable that this large number of people were all involved in some conspiracy to convince us that the Nazis killed a lot of Jews, although that never happened. So we rule out that possibility of conspiracy, and we also rule out the numbers of people involved here. Number of testimonies is also sufficient to rule out the possibility that they were all mistaken. And also, of course, we have physical evidence, such as mass graves, gas chambers, and so on. Although, as we might mention later, physical evidence is not generally part of the concept of Tawātur, as discussed by Muslim scholars, because they talked about eyewitness testimony and the transmission of eyewitness testimony by large numbers of people in each generation. They were not that concerned with physical evidence, and of course one reason is that physical evidence can be manipulated or forged.
Would it be fair to qualify the first sentence on your slide, a form of corroboration that results in certain knowledge, as a form of testimonial corroboration that results in certain knowledge?
That would be good to say. Of course, there is the technical definition given by the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh and the scholars of Ulum al-Hadith, legal theory and Hadith science. But to keep things simple, I did not want to go through the 5 elements of the technical definition. But thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that would be helpful to add testimonial corroboration. So a point which might a potential objection which might come to mind is that, all right, we said that if one person tells us something, then we usually would not attach certainty to that. And so you might think that, all right, even if we have multiple people telling us the same thing, each individual report is still conveying non-certain or probabilistic knowledge. And so couldn't we say that even the aggregation or collection of all these individual reports also conveys non-certain knowledge? But no, that is not the case, because sometimes the whole is more than the sum of its parts. As Allama Tazani, this famous theologian and scholar of usul, he points out that combination often yields what separateness does not, like the strength of a rope composed of fibers. Other analogies which you find the Islamic scholars sometimes mentioning, that yes, if you drink one sip of water, you will not, your thirst will not be quenched. But if you drink a lot of water, the thirst will be quenched, even though that glass of water or 2 glasses of water is made up of individual sips.
Yeah, you know, even in the domain of logic, you know, there's a popular fallacy, the fallacy of composition, where one assumes that the parts of a whole, you know, that the part has the same exact character traits as the whole, right? And that's not necessarily the case. So you could have individual testimonies, each one may be probabilistically true, but as a whole, as a cumulative case, they could amount to something certain. And to insist that the whole has the same character traits as the parts necessarily, that would be a logical fallacy of composition, a popular logical fallacy.
MashaAllah. Okay, so on the next 2 slides, 2 or 3 slides, I have I think 5 points which are kind of fleshing out the definition and the concept, definition of the concept of Tawātur, clarifying some details or assumptions underlying the concept. So firstly, we should note that Tawātur is a sufficient but not necessary condition for knowledge. So even if no one had witnessed the Holocaust, it would not make it untrue. Right? This is kind of like the case of if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, will it still make a sound? But yeah, for the tree, regardless if someone sees it or not, regardless, the tree has fallen, that is a true fact. And similarly, if something happened, but for some reason it was not transmitted to us, that does not prove that it didn't happen. Not every truth is necessarily transmitted. But important matters usually will be. For example, the death of a king, or the occurrence of a war. Important matters like this, or the rise of a prophet who gathers a significant number of followers. Something like that. It is based on human nature that people will talk about such things and transmit them to the next generation. Number two, Tawātur is based usually on corroborated oral testimony of witnesses. But sometimes it is not oral testimony, but action. For example, Salah, right? The Muslim ritual prayer. Salah has been conveyed by Tawātur, not verbal Tawātur, but what we could say Tawātur amali.
Mass trend, it's a mass practiced
exactly.
Act.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think maybe a similar analogy could also be the adhan. The adhan, we don't necessarily have dozens of independently documented chains of transmission explaining in detail how to say the adhan, but it's just so massively practiced generation after generation that it doesn't even cross one's mind to even question whether this has been the case, faithfully transmitted.
Yes. So things like this, the salah, the adhan, the ghusl for the dead, deceased Muslim. Muslims have been doing this in every generation. And the practice has been handed down in this way. So it is, as Ustad Bassam pointed out, it is, what is the term you used? Mass...
as mass practice, yeah.
Mass practice. Of course, that's fine. I think this point is coming on the next slide. And as you said, these Muslim scholars have not typically taken material evidence into consideration for purposes of Tawātur. But nevertheless, material evidence has some place in Islamic law, for example, but that is not something we need to talk about at this point. Number three, Tawātur might not always yield certainty of all the details. So it said that the Salah is Mutawātir by practice. What exactly about the Salah? The fact that there are 5 obligatory prayers every day. The fact that Fajr is 2 rak'ah, Dhuhr is 4, and so on. The fact that you recite audibly for Fajr and the first 2 of Maghrib and Isha, and silently in all the rest of the rak'ahs. This has been transmitted by mass practice across the generations, so we are certain of it. But there is not certainty about all the details of the Salah. For example, where do you put your hands when praying? Is it above the navel, below the navel, or do you leave them by the sides? The scholars have disagreed. Do you raise your hands before and after ruku' or not? there is uncertainty on this, and scholars have differed. Actually, there's even a minority opinion that you do not raise your hands even for the initial Allahu Akbar. So Tawātur, the basic form of the Salah is Mutawātir, but not necessarily every detail. If we go back to the Holocaust, yes, the Holocaust is Mutawātir. It definitely happened. But when we go to more specific details, was a specific person X killed in a gas chamber? How guilty was Officer Y, Nazi Officer Y? And similarly, the Quran in its broad outlines is Mutawātir. What do we mean by broad outlines? We will discuss that later, inshallah. For example, interpretation of a verse might not be certain. Of course, there are some verses which are both Mutawātir in transmission and also the meaning is unambiguous. For example, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Say, He, Allah, is one. No ambiguity of meaning here. But other verses, for example, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ. That this verse is about the waiting period for divorced women, and it's this verse specified that this waiting period is ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ, 3 quru'. But what is meant by quru'? This word is used in the Arabic language to refer to the period of menstrual bleeding, but it is also used for the opposite, for the intervals of purity between the menstrual bleedings. So which of the two meanings is intended here? It is not clear, and the scholars disagreed. So this is something we should be careful of, although, yes, the Quranic text is Mutawātir, we should be cautious of accusing someone of kufr based on a difference of interpretation of a verse. Another example, there's the famous incident at Ghadir Khum on the way back from the Hajj of the Prophet ﷺ. He stopped at this pond of Khum, which is between Mecca and Medina, and he said, Man kuntu mawlahu fa'aliyun mawlahu. That whoever's mawla I am, Ali is his mawla. So both Sunni and Shia agree that the Prophet said this. But what did the Prophet mean by this? This has been the subject of fierce debate between the Sunnis and the Shia across history. Another example was Jesus, the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, crucified or not. So yes, we could say that it is Mutawātir that someone was put on the cross and people thought that it is Isa alayhi salam, that it is Jesus. But there are uncertainties about the details. Was the person actually Jesus or not? And even if we assume, or even if we are convinced that it was Jesus, alayhi salam, did he die on the cross or not? So this also there's not certainty about. For example, even among early Christian groups, for example, in the Gnostic Gospels, we find the view that it was not actually Jesus on the cross, and Jesus actually was watching the crucifixion from a distance. And then, there's also the what is called the swoon hypothesis, which was adopted among Muslims by Sheikh Ahmed Didat, for example, that it may have been Jesus who was actually put on the cross, but he was taken down before he died. So if by crucifixion we mean putting to death on the cross, then Jesus was not crucified.
I think, as you said earlier, Doctor, because here we're focusing on testimony. So I think what we can say is that it is mutawatir, it is established that people at the time were claiming that Isa alayhi salam was crucified. However, obviously, as Muslims, we believe that there was a divine intervention and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him from the cross. And so this is more of an exceptional circumstance. But we could safely say that, that people at the time, and it established that they were saying that they thought just because it is established that people at the time thought that Isa alayhi salam was crucified or claimed that he was, that doesn't mean that their claim, their testimony is true, but the tawatur here would be that it is a fact that people were saying that back then. And this is something also, I guess also confirmed in a way implicitly in the Quran. So I guess what is established here is that people were saying this about him, but as Muslims, we would believe that there was a divine intervention.
Right.
So there's a mutawatir aspect to it, but the only aspect that is established is that people thought this at the time. There were a lot of people that thought this, but whether what they thought was true, is a different story. And I know that you'll probably be touching upon this idea in subsequent slides, but I guess another thing that we could say is that something may not be mutawatir at one stage, but reach tawatur at a different stage. And I think a good example here is the Bible. Imam al-Razi in his Qur'anic commentary, and this confused many people classically and today, Muslims and non-Muslims. He says in several places in his Qur'anic commentary that the Torah has been transmitted via tawatur, and it's impossible that corruption has happened to it. And so a lot of people misinterpreted Imam al-Razi as saying that the Torah has not been falsified, there has been no tahrif, but he has a very important clarifying statement in his book Al-Arba'in fi Usul ad-Din, where he clarifies that in the initial stages, the Torah was not mutawatir. It was actually corrupted in Babel. But after that stage, the corrupted version then reached the point of tawatur. And after that stage, it was no longer possible for the Torah to undergo further textual corruption. So and this is a very, very important clarifying statement by Imam al-Razi, right? So sometimes when we say that something is mutawatir, it does not necessarily mean that we are approving of the contents of that thing that is mutawatir. It just simply means that it is established and faithfully transmitted from point X to point Y over time in a faithful manner, but it may be divine, it may not be divine, it may be true, it may be false. But the mutawatir aspect is emphasizing that from this point to this point, we can be certain that it has been faithfully transmitted. All right, this is how I understand it. I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on that.
Thank you. Yes. So, thank you for pointing that out about Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi. Yeah, although there is the still the view of Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, that he believed that the text of the Torah has not been corrupted. The tahrif he believed was in interpretation. But yeah, I did not know that about Imam Razi, so thank you for clarifying his position. So yeah, a couple of other things based on your comments. So yes, it is possible that something initially is not mutawatir and then reaches the numbers of tawatur later on, although in that case, strictly that piece of information is not mutawatir, because in order for tawatur to be fulfilled, you must have the large numbers of transmitters at every stage without interruption, at every generation. And yeah, coming back to the crucifixion or alleged crucifixion of Jesus. So yes, it is possible that we could say that it is mutawatir, that conveyed by multiple eyewitnesses, and they conveyed to the next generation, and multiple people in that generation transmitted it to the next generation, and so on. But what is the content of the original eyewitness testimony? It is that this person was put up on the cross, not necessarily that he died, and not necessarily that it was Jesus, because they could have been mistaken that it was Jesus. They assumed it was Jesus. So the tawatur here is of this person being put on the cross, but
it has to go back every stage to the relevant point,
right.
point. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, regardless whether we take the view that, of course, the Quran does not tell us exactly what happened, and there are number of narrations, most of them mawquf narrations going back to the Sahaba about what actually happened. For example, was the likeness of Jesus cast on to one of his disciples, either someone who volunteered to be killed in his place, or on Judas, the traitor, as a punishment for him, or did something else happen, or was it, as Ahmed Didat suggested, the swoon hypothesis, that it actually was Jesus put up on the cross, but he was taken down before he died. So regardless, what is what might what we could say is mutawatir, if anything, is that someone was put up on the cross and people assumed it was Jesus. But another point is that even that has been disputed, I think, by Ibn Hazm and others. For example, we read in the Gospels that when Jesus was seized by the Romans, that the disciples all forsook him and fled. So how many people actually were eyewitnesses to the crucifixion? There were probably at least some people who witnessed it, and there's reason to think that some of the disciples came back later. But were these numbers sufficient to reach Tawātur or not? And even if it is sufficient for Tawātur, there are the other certainties that we pointed out. And of course, as Bassam alluded to earlier, we have also divine intervention here. And so this could be considered a special case from that angle. Okay, the fourth point, I think, I had said earlier 5 points, I guess it's only 4. So fourth point is how much corroboration is needed for Tawātur. And you find in the books of legal theory and Hadith science a number of opinions. Some said 4, this was the view of Ibn Hazm, 5, Ibn Hazm said 5, some said 7, some said 10, some said 70. There has been a lot of speculation on this point, but what the verifying scholars, the muhaqqiqeen, concluded is that there is no specific number. It depends on the reliability of the witnesses. This is one. For example, if we have 5 very reliable witnesses, this might be enough to give you certainty. Whereas if you have 5 lower quality witnesses, this might not be enough. And also it depends on the content of the information which is being conveyed. So in other words, the credibility threshold of the information. So, for example, if someone told us that it is snowing in Riyadh right now, we would probably need a lot more witnesses for that than if someone were to tell us that it is snowing in Antarctica right now. Okay, yeah. So, for example, miracles. Miracles are kind of violations of the natural course of events. So the credibility threshold here would typically be higher. unless, of course, you are an eyewitness, you are actually seeing it happen. But for people of later generations, the credibility threshold is typically higher, so you might not be convinced that a particular miracle happened unless you have many people narrating this in each generation. So related to this credibility threshold, if you think about it, you realize that antecedent beliefs and theological assumptions will play a role in this threshold. So, for example, if someone for example, believes that the laws of nature are immutable, then he will probably be skeptical of narrations about miracles, even if many people are narrating it to him. But actually not necessarily, but because, and actually there are some people who have done this. They try to find, I guess, among Christians and also among Muslims, that they find a way to accept that this what seemed to be a miracle actually happened, but they find a way to explain it in terms of natural laws. So, for example, there was a news article which I read on BBC News a number of years ago. I'm sure if you Google it, you'll find it. So there were some scientists who came up with this theory that the parting of the waters for Moses, Prophet Musa alayhi salam, actually could have happened naturally by a confluence of certain conditions in the atmosphere and the related to the winds and so on, that all of these natural conditions could have converged to make the this sort of parting of the waters possible naturally without any violation of natural laws. So, yeah, if someone does believe that the laws of nature are immutable, they might have a higher threshold of credibility, but they would not necessarily have to reject this miracle. And also, of course, if we are talking about science, this is a bigger discussion. And maybe if Ustad Bassam has not already had someone to discuss this, maybe he would have someone in the future, that how much certainty does science actually yield? Because we know, for example, that scientific knowledge changes. Earlier theories are abandoned in the light of new information. Sometimes people discover new laws, for example, or or come up with new theories. But anyway, the point here related to Tawātur is how many narrations do you need to reach Tawātur? Your prior beliefs and your theological assumptions will play a role. So we talked about prior beliefs, and as example of theological assumptions. For example, the Mu'tazila, among others, had the belief that it is not possible to see Allah. And so even though there are many, many hadith, which according to many scholars reach the level of Mutawātir, because of this theological assumption or a belief of the that Allah, that it is not, it is impossible to see Allah because because basically the Mu'tazila said that seeing involves light hitting a physical object and reflecting back into the eye, and Allah is not a physical object, therefore it is impossible to see Allah. And so these narrations about hadith narrations where the Prophet is saying that the believers will see Allah, the Mu'tazila said we have to figuratively interpret these narrations. But the Sunnis, on the other hand, they said that what the Mu'tazila said about seeing, this is one type of seeing. How do we know, how can we rule out that there's not another definition of seeing that applies to Allah? And so the Sunnis generally say that we have to take this hadith literally, but the literal meaning of seeing for Allah is not about light hitting a physical object. Okay, the picture on the right is related to this point. How many narrations do you need in order to reach the Tawātur? This is this is similar to the what philosophers call the heap paradox or the bald man paradox. So if a man has a full head of hair, is he bald? No, obviously not. If you remove one hair from this man's head, is he bald or not? No. If you remove two hairs, is he bald or not? No. If you remove all his hair other than one strand of hair, can he be described as bald? Yes. So what is the dividing line? If you say that it is maybe if a person has less than 40 hairs, we can describe him as bald. Maybe that you could say that. But now, what if, is it really that different if you add one hair to 40? In other words, he has 41 hairs. Is there really a perceptible difference? Or if you remove one hair, 39 hairs. So there is an elusiveness involved here. but definitely, if the man has a full head of hair, he is not bald, and if he has no hairs at all, he is bald. But where is the dividing line? Is it not clear? And it may depend on other factors. For example, how close are you to him? And similarly, if someone drinks one gulp of water, is this enough to quench his thirst? No, probably not. But if someone has drunk 10 glasses of water and he's saying his thirst is still not quenched, then we will not believe that, because 10 glasses of water is enough to quench his thirst. So either this person is lying or he has something wrong with him. Either a cognitive impairment or some type of disease.
So I think what the paradox is maybe trying to aim at, Dr. Suheil, is, and I guess, with the analogies that you provided, is that, look, there will always be gray areas when it comes to determining certain things, but that does not discount the fact that there are clear binaries, that there are clear cases. So just because we cannot come and pinpoint exactly at what stage does a person transition from being a bald man to not being a bald man, that doesn't mean that I do not have confidence when I actually see a very clear example of a bald man, right? So, there will be those clear binary cases, and there will always be those gray areas that are open to debate, but that does not discount the fact that there are many clear binary cases that we should be confident to affirm. And someone cannot come and say, oh, no, you can't say that this person is bald until you resolve for me all the gray areas. No, that's nonsense. No one thinks that way. No one believes that you have to resolve the gray areas just in order to affirm what the clear cases are.
Barakallah. Thank you. That is a very succinct statement of the main point here. So applying that to Tawātur, yes, there are ambiguous cases. There are in Hadith, for example, there are Hadith which are some scholars say are Mutawātir, but others disagree. But this does not change the fact that there are some unambiguous cases of Tawātur. For example, the basic form of the Salah. The basic form of the Adhan, even though there are some disagreements regarding some details of the Salah and Adhan. And similarly, the Uthmanic text of the Quran also. This text is Mutawātir. Okay.
Yeah.
History of Tawātur. So this term Tawātur, as Bassam pointed out in the beginning, is used across multiple disciplines. It is used by this philosopher, the Arab philosophers. It is used by the theologians, the Mutakallimin, by the Usulis, the legal theorists, scholars of Usul al-Fiqh. It is used also by the Fuqaha and the scholars of Ulum al-Quran, scholars of Ulum al-Hadith, and even it comes up in Usul al-Nahu, meta grammar. People like Suyuti and others who wrote on Usul al-Nahu. And the concept of Tawātur in each discipline is not necessarily the same. And this sometimes leads to confusion when people try to apply the Hadith concept of Tawātur, this concept of Tawātur from Ulum al-Hadith to apply this to Ulum al-Qur'an, to the Qira'at, for example. So and we'll come to something about that, inshallah, later. But basically, coming back to the history, so it seems that the Arab philosophers imported this concept of Tawātur from the Greek empiricists, who used it to talk about knowledge of distant lands and knowledge of history. For example, I have never been to China, but I don't have any doubt that China exists, because the number of testimonies about the existence of China in books and oral testimonies, people who have visited China and told me about it, all of this together reaches Tawātur. Similarly, about history, we don't have any doubt that, for example, the Battle of Hastings occurred, and that probably occurred in 1066, even though we were not there to witness it, because this testimony has been conveyed to us. So the empiricists and philosophers used Tawātur primarily to talk about knowledge of distant lands and knowledge of history. But the Muslim theologians, initially it was the Mu'tazila, adopted this concept and refined it and developed it further. And they applied it to transmission of religious texts, Quran and Hadith. So there was no question about the Quran. There was no dispute among the Mu'tazila about the Quran. But for the Hadith, they used the concept of Tawātur to kind of weed out Hadith which were suspect. So if a Hadith was not Mutawātir, then, as we said, Tawātur yields certainty. So if something is not Mutawātir, it is not conveying absolute certainty. And so there's a chance of errors. So especially if there's some reason to doubt the content of this Hadith, then it can be left aside on the basis of stronger evidence. So that is what the Mu'tazila were doing. And then this concept was elaborated further by the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh, Islamic legal theory. And legal theory, Usul al-Fiqh, was heavily influenced by Kalam, which is a specific approach to theology, which started with the Mu'tazila, and then later on it was adopted by others, including some Sunnis, Ash'aris, and Maturidis, for example. So Kalam had a strong influence on Usul al-Fiqh, and this is how the term and concept of Tawātur finds its way into Usul al-Fiqh, and actually you find many of the theological discussions, for example, about the crucifixion of Jesus. Although these are theological issues, you find many of the early Usul al-Fiqh books discussing these concepts because of the influence of Kalam. Also, another important point is that the Maliki madhab tied this concept of Tawātur in with the concept of Amal. Amal, which is practice or massively transmitted practice, which is an important source, especially for the Malikis and to some extent also for the Hanafis. So you can see the parallels.
I believe for the Malikis, Dr. Suheil, it was specifically for the people of Medina, right?
Exactly.
Amal Ahl al-Medina.
Yes, thank you. For the Malikis, Amal of Ahl Medina, and for the Hanafis, Amal of the people of Kufa in the early generations. With the first few generations. So yeah, you can see the parallels. In both cases, we have a massive number of people either transmitting, massive number of people transmitting something in both cases. The difference is for the Usuli Tawātur is usually by verbal transmission, but for Amal it is transmission by practical demonstration. So yeah, we find early Maliki Usulis explicitly making this connection between Tawātur and Amal, people like Ibn al-Qassar and others. Also, the scholars of legal theory did discuss Tawātur of the Quran as well. And more on that coming up. Also, we can note that the Hadith folk, the Ahlul Hadith, were using the term Tawātur as a semi-technical term to describe hadiths which have multiple chains of transmission. And then later on, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, 5th Hijri century, synthesized the Ulum al-Hadith, Hadith science discourse with the Usul al-Fiqh discourse. He merged the two, and after that, Tawātur as a not anymore semi-technical but fully technical term became well established in the circles of the Hadith scholars. But yeah, when we find people like Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim, using the word Tawātur, it is important to note that it is not necessarily identical with the technical term of Tawātur used by the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh, along with all its trappings and caveats and details. Because, of course, people like Imam al-Bukhari were not part of this discourse. They were opposed to Kalam, and they were not involved in the Kalami Usul al-Fiqh. And there are, of course, parallels. Of course, this concept of corroboration, even if you are not, you do not have any background in Kalam or Usul al-Fiqh, it is a natural concept of corroboration. So even among the Ashab al-Hadith, who are generally opposed to Kalam, they did have this concept that if you have more multiple chains of transmission, this increases the possibility of correctness. And I've talked more about this in my dissertation, which inshallah will be released probably by next year as a book. Okay, so this is a timeline. So 4th century BCE, we have the Greek empiricists who used this concept, although they did not use this name of Tawātur, but this is the same concept. And then 8th century Common Era, we have the Mu'tazili theologians, as we said, who adopted and developed and refined this concept. By the following century, we have if not earlier, we have the Hadith folk using the term in a semi-technical sense. By the 10th century, we have the legal theorists developing and refining the concept of Tawātur. 10th to 11th century, we have the Tahrif debates about the alleged corruption of the text of the Quran, which we'll come to, and I think on the next slide. 11th century, we have Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who synthesized the Usul al-Fiqh into the Ulum al-Hadith. And also in this century, we have the rise of the Qur'anic Isnad. Ibn Salah, who died 1245, Common Era, raised the question of that are there any Mutawātir hadiths or not? And this drew a lot of attention and debate, and continued to be debated over the centuries. Are there any Mutawātir hadiths? If so, how many, and so on. And another major development, Imam As-Suyuti, who died in 1505, Common Era, 911 Hijri. He was the first, at least that we know of, to compile a collection of hadiths, collection of Mutawātir hadiths, a book which is dedicated to Mutawātir hadiths, or at least hadiths which the author believed were Mutawātir. So the next thing you want to talk about is Qur'anic Tawātur. We have just finished discussing the concept of Tawātur and something about its history in Islamic thought. And as you said, the most important or the importance of Tawātur to Islamic thought is primarily in two areas, Quran and Hadith. So is the Quran Mutawātir, any Hadith Mutawātir or not? And why is this important? Because, as you said, Tawātur conveys certainty. So if something is certainly part of Islam, for example, if we know that this belief, for example, is established by Tawātur, then it is unquestionably a part of Islam, and so to reject it would be kufr. Because so whether that is something in the Quran, or even if it is a hadith, provided we are satisfied that the hadith is mutawātir, and provided also that there is no room for interpretation. Okay, so Qur'anic Tawātur, we need to talk about two dimensions of the Quran, the written dimension and the oral dimension. So Tawātur of the text, the written text, and then Tawātur of the qira'at, the recitations or readings. So we start with Tawātur of the text. So as you know, Uthman radhiyallahu anhu had an official codex of the Quran distributed to some of the major Muslim cities of that time, whether it was 5 or 7 or more or less. There's some disagreement, some discrepancy in the narrations, but aside from that, he did do this, and his official version of the Quran was accepted by the public. So this is about a couple of decades after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And then Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the infamous Umayyad governor, took further measures to enforce the codex and make sure that people were using only this official version of the Quran. Yeah, but before we get to that, coming back to Uthman, we know that actually Abdullah ibn Mas'ud did not want to give up his personal mushaf. And so is this problematic? In terms of, because basically the argument here is that we are saying that Uthman's official copy of the Quran is Mutawātir. But what about the descent of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud? This does not really detract from the Tawātur of the text of the Quran, because number one, what has been reported about the difference between Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's codex, his mushaf, and the Uthman's mushaf, there's not that much different. That is the first point. And the second point is that although Ibn Mas'ud did not want to give up his mushaf, he did not find fault with Uthman's copy. He did not try to prohibit people from using Uthman's copy, which he would have if there was something majorly wrong with it. Okay. But in any case, the recitations, kind of anomalous recitations traced back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud continue to be recited for quite some time, at least into the 4th Hijri century. Okay, now coming back to, or moving forward to Al-Hajjaj. As you said, he took further measures to enforce the Codex of Uthman, and it's as Nicholas Sinai has pointed out in a couple of his articles, Hajjaj's influence outside of Iraq was limited, and that an uncoerced attainment of acceptance probably played a significant role in ensuring the ultimate ascendancy of the canonical Rasm, in other words, the Uthmanic text of the Quran. In other words, basically he is refuting those who claim that it was Hajjaj who actually finalized the text of the Quran and propagated it. That it was Hajjaj and not Uthman. So as Sinai has pointed out, Hajjaj's influence outside Iraq was limited. So even if we say that he could have forced people in Iraq to use his version of the Quran, he would not have been able to do this for people outside of Iraq. And so, as Sinai observes, it was probably more of an uncoerced attainment of acceptance based on the reputation of Uthman, and probably the fact that the Uthmanic text was already conforming to the oral recitation of the Quran, which people were familiar with it, and so they naturally accepted it, this text. Also, Michael Cook has shown that the variants attributed to the regional codices, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have these original regional codices, which were sent by Uthman to Mecca and to Kufa and so on, but we have reports of the differences between these codices. So Cook has shown that these variants form a stemma that is consistent with these descending from a common archetype. And actually, Haytham Siddiqui has a more recent article also on where he has essentially proven the existence of these regional masahif.
Dr. Suheil, can you elaborate maybe a little bit on what the word stemma means, in case some of our listeners don't know?
Yes, I could do that. If you want to do that, you're welcome.
No, please, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I will give kind of general explanation, because this is not in my area of specialty or expertise, but this is related to transmission of texts, and so you basically gather all the later versions of the text, and then you try to reconstruct the original. That is what a stemma is about.
Great.
Okay, and in addition to this, we have the cross-sectarian collective memory of the Muslims across the sects, right? So we know that all Muslims, whether Sunni or Shi'i or even not, there are and have been sects that are neither Sunni nor Shi'i. For example, the Khawarij and the Ibadis. And even within each of these sects, for example, within the Shia, we have the Zaydis, we have the Ithna Asharis, the Twelvers, we have the Ismailis, and at times there have, all of these sects have disagreements, sometimes major disagreements, and at times they were even willing to fight each other based on this. But one thing they never disagreed on was the Quran. All these texts use the same text of the Quran.
Yeah, and I think that's remarkable, because no sect tried to claim that, oh no, this ayah was removed from the Quran and this ayah supports the doctrines that we adopt, or any of these things. So I mean, this is a very strong testament to, I guess, the credibility of the Quranic transmission, that no one even thought of making the claim that some of the Quran may have been changed, or is missing, or tried to even add their own verse in support of their own theological group, and I think that's quite remarkable.
Exactly. Although there is the issue of tahrif, which we'll get into, but for example, we know there was fabrication of hadiths. Many people made up hadiths, but there was never anyone who tried to fabricate a verse of the Quran, because it would immediately have been recognized, because the Quran has a public presence and has always had a public presence in the Muslim community. So if someone tried to invent their own verse and said, I have a verse of the Quran which no one else has, he would immediately be recognized and condemned as a liar. So yeah, all these sects and schools use exactly the same Quran, which is the version of the Quran which was distributed by Uthman. Regardless, Sunni or Shia, and among the Shia, regardless, Ithna Ashari or Zaydi. If you go to Iran or you go to Indonesia or Saudi Arabia or Morocco, it is the same text of the Quran, which is the Uthmanic text. Okay, and to add to that, I didn't put this on the slide, but we also have material evidence. In the form of early manuscripts of the Quran or pages of the Quran, which by radiocarbon dating can be dated very, very early, extremely early, within a few decades of the death of the Prophet. And for some of these, it is even possible, because of course there's some uncertainty with this technique of dating. So at the latest, a few decades after the Prophet's death, and at the earliest, even possibly within the lifetime of the Prophet. So a number of years ago, there was a lot of hype, and this was in the news about the Birmingham manuscript. And if you actually look at that, I should have actually included an image of that. In any case, if you look at the text of that, and of course there are no dots and no vowels, but if you compare the skeletal text of that manuscript with the Quran we read today, which is printed today, it is exactly the same. Okay, so we are can have very high confidence that the text of the Quran is Mutawātir. How about the oral dimension of the Quran? In other words, the qira'at. So for those who may not know, there are two types of qira'ah, two types of oral readings of the Quran, the Mutawātir and the Shadh. At least that is the terms which are usually used. So there are those which have been widely recited in the early community, which are at least 7, and most scholars add another 3 to that to make it 10. And then there are those that were either not that widely recited in the early community, or that differ from the Uthmanic text. They have extra words or words omitted, for example. So those are called shadh. anomalous or irregular. So, according to the majority of scholars, these anomalous readings should not be used in Salah. Many scholars of usul went even further to say that these shadh transmissions of the Quran are not even considered Quran. Actually, among the scholars of ulum al-Quran, they are usually more cautious. They do not categorically say this is not Quran, but they say it is not, you should not use it in Salah, but we do not categorically say that it is not Quran. Okay, so there are also another point. There are also isnads, chains of narration for the qira'at. So those people who have ijazah for Quran, typically they will have to recite the Quran from memory to their teacher without mistakes, or sometimes a small number of mistakes are permitted if you can correct yourself. But basically recite from memory to the teacher, and then also the recitation must be correct, with correct tajweed, and then the teacher will issue this ijazah, authorization, to recite the Quran and to teach it to others. And the ijazah document would typically include this chain of narration that the teacher will say, I recited the Quran from beginning to end from memory to my teacher, who recited it to his teacher, and the names of all of the teachers would be mentioned, and so on and so forth, until we get to Hafs, for example. So most of the Muslims today recite the Quran according to reading of Hafs and Asim, which is one of the 10 famous qira'at that I mentioned. And then Hafs has his isnad back to the Prophet ﷺ. So this is the Quranic isnad. Actually, Ingrid Mattson, in her book, what is it? The story of the Quran. There's one chapter where she talked about the isnad of the Quran. So if you want an introduction to this concept, please consult that book. So this isnad can be divided into 4 parts. The portion of the isnad from today back to Imam Ibn al-Jazari, who was a famous reciter of the Quran, and has written books on the qira'at and other subjects also. So this portion of the Quran is without doubt Mutawātir, because there are literally thousands of isnads across the world today, all going back to Imam Ibn al-Jazari. So far, if we consider this portion, we have established Tawātur of the Quran from Ibn al-Jazari up to today. But what about before that? Then the next portion of the Isnad is from Ibn al-Jazari to the books of transmission, which were written earlier, like At-Taysir by Abu Amr ad-Dani, 5th Hijri century, I think 444 he died. Rawdat ibn al-Mu'addil and other books. At-Sab'a by Ibn Mujahid and others. So Ibn al-Jazari has a total of more than 1,000 isnads of his own, going back to more than 50 of these early books. Each of which he read with his teachers, and his teachers read with their teachers in an unbroken chain of transmission to the authors of all of these 50 plus books. So based on this, there can be little doubt that this portion of the Isnad also is Mutawātir. The next portion is from these books of transmission, like At-Taysir, Al-Rawda, As-Sab'a, up to the eponymous reciters. So yeah, these famous 7 or 10 reciters are named after specific Qur'an, specific reciters who publicly taught these readings. So as I said, about 90% of the Muslim world recites the Quran today according to the reading of Hafs, who transmits from Asim. Asim is one of the 10 famous reciters. In other words, Asim is one of the 10 eponymous reciters because the reading is named after Asim. Hafs is one of the transmitters. So Asim had many students. Hafs is one of them. And of the students of all of these 10 famous reciters, of course, they had many students, but 2 transmitters of each of these, 2 transmitters from each of these eponymous reciters became famous.
And roughly when did these eponymous reciters live? How close to the Prophet ﷺ's time? Roughly.
Yes, so the earliest died, let's see, about 120 Hijri. Let's see, who is the earliest?
Yeah, because I kind of just wanted our listeners just to get a rough idea. So here, we said Ibn al-Jazari is around 833. Died around 833, and the books of transmission were roughly speaking maybe 300 to 400 years before Ibn al-Jazari, roughly, and the eponymous reciters were roughly 100 to maybe 150, 200 years.
Yes.
Maybe not 200, 100 maybe to 150 years after after Hijrah.
Yeah.
Just to have that kind of in our minds. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, I think the earliest of the eponymous reciters died about 120 Hijri. And the books of transmission, as we said, are 4th and 5th century, many of them. So from the books of transmission to the eponymous reciters, as we said, there are more than 40 books. Each of these books has multiple isnads. So when you put all of this together, all of these books together, we can conclude that this portion of the isnad also is mutawatir, because we have a large number of isnads for each of these 10 recitations. The final portion of the isnad, from the eponymous reciters back to the Prophet. We can divide this into two portions in terms of the content of the Quran. What all the reciters agree upon, which is the majority of the Quran, we could say that this is also mutawatir. But what they disagree on, for example, Hafs recites Maliki Yawmiddin. Many other reciters like Nafi' recite Maliki Yawmiddin. So details like this also, for example, how long is the mad? Ulaika, ulaika. Also some of the rules of tajweed. For example, idgham with ghunna or without ghunna, right? There is sometimes disagreement on things like this. So these disagreed aspects, it is difficult to claim that they are mutawatir, because if you look at the isnads from the eponymous reciters back to the Prophet ﷺ, there is only one person or at most a couple of people in each generation. This is not enough for tawatur. But if you put the isnad of all of the eponymous reciters together, then you can make, as we said, a case for tawatur of what they all agreed on, because now we have multiple isnads. Okay, but is this problematic? It is not really problematic. Yeah, I'll skip to this slide, because for one thing, as John Burton points out, even if you take into consideration all of the qira'at, not only the canonical recitations, not only the 10 famous ones, but also the shawādh, which, as we said, the anomalous recitations, which according to some scholars should not even be considered Quran. Even if you include them, there's no major difference in belief or practice which comes about on the basis of any of these readings. So, to add to that, we have to realize that there's not much original data from this early period, first 2 centuries of the Islamic era. There's not much that has survived in original manuscript. For example, we are told that some of these early scholars wrote books on qira'at. For example, Abu Ubaid al-Qasim had a book in which he detailed the details of 50 different qira'at, but this has not survived. And this is a perennial problem or recurring problem in history or historiography, which is the case not only for Islamic origins, but also for other religions, because there's a dearth of original data and sources. And so Tawātur of the readings from the eponymous reciters back to the Prophet cannot be meaningfully studied in the way that is possible for later periods, for example, by collecting the isnads. Nevertheless, there is a compelling aggregation of evidence that the oral Quran was ubiquitous among the early generations of Muslims. For example, in the text of the Quran itself, we have الذين آتيناهم الكتاب يتلونه حق تلاوته, that the believers recite the book with this true recital. So definitely the Sahaba would have been careful to recite the Quran correctly. They would have also paid attention to teaching the next generation to recite the Quran properly and correctly. Then also we have numerous hadiths about the centrality of the Quran for the early Muslims. The Quran was the reason that many people accepted Islam, especially among the Sahaba. It was a devotional act. It is required to recite some of the Quran in Salah. There's a reward for reciting even one letter of the Quran. So the early Muslims, the Quran was important to them. Then, as William Graham observes, the oral sense of the Quran is the original. Remember, a lot of people in that time in Arabia did not know how to read or write. They would learn Quran by hearing it and repeating after the teacher. And then, not long after the death of the Prophet, Umar radiallahu anhu established the collective Taraweeh prayers in the masjid, where the entire Quran would be recited over the course of the month of Ramadan, probably more than once. So this establishes an early public oral presence for the Quran.
Yeah. Can one also argue, Dr. Suheil, that there was no motivation, so to speak, to document any isnads
Exactly.
for these established readings during that time? Because it's my understanding that the one of the things that primarily spurred the early Muslims to start documenting asanid for the ahadith is because they're seeing a lot of fabrications of ahadith around them, and then they said to themselves, okay, this is becoming a problem. We need to find a way to verify all these ahadith that are being relayed, in all these different regions by all these different people. They saw that this was becoming a problem, and that this had to be contained through the isnad system. But given that this was, as you've clearly shown in the previous slide, that there were no serious contentions with the veracity of these massly transmitted qira'at that were being recited in Taraweeh and were abiding by the Uthmanic Rasm or the Uthmanic text in terms of this codex. There really was no drive to even document the isnads. The question isn't, were they capable of doing so if they wanted to, but rather, was there any need for them to do so back at that time? And I think it's difficult for Muslims today to probably fathom that, because right now, as Muslims, we are so accustomed to the idea of the isnad system as an epistemic tool of verification that we feel that we forget that we should, if we were to place ourselves back in at that time, especially the first 100 years after Hijrah, that people, that if you were to even take that initiative, people will look at you and say, why would you even do that?
Exactly.
And so I think that's something to consider as well. There was one question I wanted to ask, and I think this goes back to you made a dichotomy. You made the dichotomy that the qira'ah was either mutawatir or shad, or an anomalous reading. And when I look at statements of early scholars on what the conditions are for a sahih reading, a sahih qira'ah, their conditions were that, okay, it abides by the Uthmanic text, that it aligns with established Islamic Arabic grammar, and that there are sahih isnads for the reading. And they didn't stipulate that it had to be mutawatir. They just said, is there a sahih isnad to this? So is there a third category here that can we say that, okay, these are sahih qira'at, they're not shadh, they're not necessarily mutawatir. Yes. They're not mutawatir in the sense of documented isnads, like in that hadithic sense. And I know you're going to clarify hadith and amal al-ma'nawi later on, perhaps, but can we just say that this is a sahih qira'ah, which is neither mutawatir in that sense, nor shadh in that rejected sense?
Yes, barakallah fiik. So yes, what I said earlier was a simplification, and again in my in my book I discuss this in detail. So for example, Imam al-Suyuti in the Itqan has broken it down into more than 5 categories of qira'at, and the term shadh actually at different points in history and by different scholars was used with different implications. So at times it was used for something which did not conform to the Uthmanic texts. At times it was used for something which was not mutawatir, and possibly other definitions also. So the conditions, you mentioned the 3 conditions. Yes. So yes, there's some disagreement here also. So, but basically what Imam Ibn al-Jazari ended up with, and because of his expertise in this field, many scholars after him accepted this as the final word, that the qira'ah must conform to the Uthmanic Codex, as you said. Number two, it should conform to Arabic grammar. In other words, it should not have grammatical errors. And number three, what Ibn al-Jazari ended up with is it should be mashhur, widely recited in the early community. In an earlier book, I think, he
Nashr?
which one? Munjid al-Muqri'in, he said Mutawātir, and then in the Nashr he actually said no, Tawātir is not a condition, but it should at least be mashhur, widely recited in the early community, even if not Mutawātir. And there's some disagreement as to how to handle what to make of this discrepancy between his two books. So there are some who say that Ibn al-Jazari changed his mind, that initially he thought that it must be Mutawātir, and then he changed his mind and said not necessarily Mutawātir, but at least mashhur. And then there are some who say that no, he didn't change his mind, but he kind of broadened the scope of what is acceptable to include not just Mutawātir, but also mashhur. But yeah, as you were alluding to, there are other categories. For example, if it has a Sahih isnad, but it is not Mutawātir, then some would say that this is classified as shadh, but others would say that no, it is neither Mutawātir nor shadh, but we should use a third term, which is ahad. So yeah, as I said, if you, I think the most expensive classification, most number of categories that I have come across is by Suyuti in the Itqan. I believe the Itqan has been translated.
I believe, is that Ahmed von Denver, or is that something else?
No, that's I don't think Ahmed von Denver has his own book on Ulum al-Quran, but I think there's already a translation out there, and then Dr. Suheil Saeed has been working on his own translation. From what I heard from him, that existing translation has some problems. So, yeah, in any case, let's move on.
Yeah,
So,
apparently there's an English translation by someone called Munir Farid. Munir Farid.
Yeah, but actually, if you actually get hold of the English translation, make sure that it is actually a translation, because once I came across a book which was titled whatever, the Perfection in the Sciences of the Quran by Suyuti, but actually the content was not a translation of Suyuti's book.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so I'm not sure if this one, Munir Farid, is the kind of fake itqan, or it's if that was by someone else.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's another translation by a sister in the UK, Aisha, I think Aisha something. I think hers is actually the Quran. Okay. So yeah, as Ustad Bassam pointed out, there was not really a need to verify the Quran via Isnad. And it was only in the 5th Hijri century, 11th Common Era century, that we have the rise of the Qur'anic Isnad and the application of this term Mutawātir to the Quran. So before this time, it seems there was a reluctance to use the term, despite or perhaps precisely because this term was already used in Hadith. And the scholars were aware of a qualitative difference between transmission of the Quran and transmission of the Hadith. So, long story short, the Quranic Isnad emerged much later. In the earlier period, there was no need for it. And so it is misleading to rely on the Quranic Isnad as a means for ascertaining the Tawātur of the Quran. Rather, the Quranic Isnad is a type of sampling of the ubiquitous oral tradition. So, for example, Imam Nafi', one of the eponymous reciters, although if you look at the actual Isnad in the ijazas of Quran which we have today, the actual Isnad from Nafi' to the Prophet is only one person in each generation. But we know that, for example, from the biographical accounts and so on, that Imam Nafi' had over 70 teachers of Quran.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Qira'at can be considered Mutawātir back to the Prophet, but only in a general sense, that the Quran has always had a solid, ubiquitous oral presence, not down to the smaller details. And Sunni scholarship, particularly within Ulum al-Quran, those who were experts in the Qira'at, that have shown an awareness of this. But when you come to those who are not necessarily experts in the Qira'at, you find kind of lack of awareness of this and kind of insistence on that even the smaller details of the Quran are Mutawātir and so on. So you find kind of exaggerated views among the non-specialists. Okay, before we move on to Hadith, we have referred to the Tahrif doctrine a couple of times earlier. So what was this? Tahrif, which essentially means corruption or distortion. So this was the view that emerged, that the Quran has undergone tahrif. When did this doctrine emerge? We don't know for sure, but it seems that, yeah, it may have emerged early. Within the first century, there's some reference to it in a text transmitted from the first century, although the authenticity of the text has been debated by some. But it's, even if it was present in the late first century, regardless of that, it seems it only came to prominence in the late third century, which we have the Imam al-Hadi, the Zaydi Imam, condemning this belief, which he attributes to some of the 12 Shia. So Imam al-Hadi died late third century, I believe, around 290 Hijri or so. And then definitely in the next century and into the beginning of the 5th century, we have ample attestation that this view was present among the 12 Shia. There were debates going on between those 12 Shia who held this view on one side, and on the other side, the Sunnis and the Mu'tazili scholars, people like Imam al-Baqillani, the Ash'ari, famous Ash'ari Maliki scholar, and his the first image on the left is his book Al-Intisar, which he wrote in response to this doctrine of Tahrif. Next to that, there's the book Al-Mughni by Qadi Abdul Jabbar, the famous Mu'tazili scholar. They were contemporary. He was a contemporary of Baqillani. Mughni is a multi-volume theological work, but a major part of one of the volumes is devoted to refuting the notion that the Qur'anic texts have been changed. So yeah, what exactly were these 12 Shia claiming? They were claiming that some of the Quran has been lost. They did not deny that the rest of the Quran, which we have and which they, as well as other Muslims, recited in Salah and so on, that this is authentic and that this is a binding source of belief and practice and ethics.
So they didn't claim that anything was falsely added. They just claimed that
yes,
some things were missing.
Yes, they didn't claim that anything was added, nor that anything was changed in the Uthmanic text. But they claimed that there are some verses that didn't make it into the Uthmanic text. So there was fierce debate between the proponents of that view and the majority. And eventually, even among the 12 Shia, this view of Tahrif was sidelined. For example, Sheikh al-Mufid, famous 12 Shia theologian and scholar, contemporary of Baqillani and Qadi Abdul Jabbar. He initially was kind of wavering on whether there's some of the Quran which was revealed to the Prophet but did not make it into the Uthmanic text. But after these debates and discussions, he concluded that that was not the case and that the Uthmanic texts could represent the complete Quran. And this, as I agree here with Professor Hussein Mudarrisi, who says that this was the original 12th view, that the Quran is complete, and then in the middle, probably late 3rd century, some of the 12 of Shia came up with this view that some of the Quran is missing, but then even that view did not gain currency, and then the 12 of Shia reverted to the original Shia view that the Quran is indeed complete, and this is the view which continues to be held today by the overwhelming majority of Shia theologians, to this day there are 12 Shia scholars who are writing books defending the integrity of the Quran. Among them, Ayatollah Abu Qasim al-Khui, in his Muqaddimah to his tafsir, he has refuted the view of those 12 Shia who claim that the Quran is incomplete. The third image from the left is a cover of the book فصل الخطاب في تحريف كتاب رب الأرباب, which is a later book. What is the name of the author?
Like a Tabarisi?
Tabarsi, yes.
Tabarsi, sorry. Yeah. It was a bit small. Yeah. Okay.
Tabarsi, actually, there were many scholars by the name Tabarsi. This is one of them. So he wrote this book. Translation of the title is the decisive statement concerning the distortion of the book of the Lord of all the Lords, in which he is supporting this minority 12 Shia view that there are parts of the Quran missing. So from time to time, among certain, for example, Akhbari branch of the 12 Shia, you do find resurgence of this view, but it remained a marginal view across history. And as you said, the vast majority of Shia scholars, and according to Professor Mudarrisi, this was the original 12 Shia view that the Quran is indeed complete. So the concept of Tawātur was central to these discussions about and the refutations of Tahrif, Sunni and Mu'tazili refutations. And as we just mentioned, this was a huge success and resulted in the view of Tahrif effectively becoming sidelined. Okay, I think we can ready to move on to Tawātur and Hadith. Okay. So I mentioned to you earlier that we have the early Hadith folk who are mostly opposed to the Kalam approach to theology. So more on these early Hadith folk, their epistemology was Isnad-based, and they were typically opposed to Kalam. They were more concerned with emulation of tradition, following the pious predecessors. But they did show an awareness of gradation of truth values. For example, Imam Shafi'i, in his book Al-Risala on Usul al-Fiqh, he divided knowledge into ilm al-amma and ilm al-khassa. Ilm al-amma, public knowledge, and ilm al-khassa, basically knowledge of specialists. So ilm al-amma is effectively equivalent to the highest level of Tawātur. So even though Imam Shafi'i does not use the word Tawātur, we see that he was aware of this concept that there is a gradation of truth values. And similarly, as I have written about, you find this indications of this awareness in from what other among other early Hadith folk. Then we have this other group, the Usuliyin, the legal theorists, scholars of Usul. Of course, in particular in later times, you have people that were members of both groups. But at least initially there was this dichotomy. But so the legal theorists generally embraced Kalam, and they inherited from the early Mu'tazili scholars of Kalam a wariness or even sometimes skepticism towards Hadith. And related to this, they were more concerned than the Hadith folk with gradation of truth values, whether this Hadith conveys certainty or not, whereas the early Ahlul Hadith were not really concerned whether this Hadith conveys certainty or not. As long as it is Sahih, they would say that we accepted this. Okay. Then eventually, there was a kind of triumph of rationalism that led to the Hadith folk accepting the term Tawātur. And as I said, it was not really alien to their to the concepts with which they had. So it is not really the fact that they accepted the term Tawātur
Maybe
from
the concept just got systematized a bit more formally.
Exactly. Yes. So it is not correct to say that they were selling out by accepting this concept, because it is in line with concept they already had. And as Ustad Bassam is pointing out, it is maybe they realized that the scholars of Kalam and Usul have kind of systematized and refined these concepts with which the Ahlul Hadith already had. Okay, so eventually Ahlul Hadith accepted the term Tawātur, and later, 8th century Hijri, actually Hafid ibn Taymiyyah turned this back on the scholars of the Kalam, and used it as used Tawātur as an argument against the Kalam folk, who had actually come up with this concept originally. Okay, application of Tawātur to hadiths. So, are there any Mutawātir hadiths? It depends whom you ask. Hafid ibn Hibban, for example, said there are no Mutawātir hadiths. Ibn as-Salah said that I'm trying to remember his statement. As Bassam, do you remember how he expressed this in his Muqaddimah? Basically, he was saying that the definition, if we apply the definition of Mutawātir in practice, it is doubtful that any hadith satisfy this definition, except possibly one hadith, which is the hadith man كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. Whoever deliberately lies against me should seek his place in the hellfire. So basically, Ibn Salah is saying that there are probably not any Mutawātir hadiths, but if there is any hadith which is Mutawātir, it is this one. But this view of Ibn Hibban and Ibn Salah was not unanimous. We have some scholars labeling hadith as Mutawātir before Ibn Salah and after. So definitely beyond doubt, in the 6th Hijri century, we have people like Qadi Iyad, the Maliki scholar, labeling a number of hadiths as Mutawātir. This is in his book Ash-Shifa, and possibly elsewhere as well. So definitely the latest date for this is 6th Hijri century, but even in the previous century, 5th Hijri century, we have Ibn Hazm labeling the hadiths about wiping on the khufs as Mutawātir, and the hadiths about raising the hands, رفع اليدين in the salah as mutawatir. Ibn Abd al-Barr for the adhan being mutawatir, and he said that ending the prayer with one or two taslims, both of mutawatir, and among others, among other examples in his tamheed, and possibly even as early as the 4th century with Al-Hakim and Naif Saburi. Okay, and as part of my PhD research, I compiled. Actually, I don't compile the statistic, but I used the book of Muhammad Ja'far al-Kattani, in which he traced the scholars who, across history, who labeled hadith as mutawatir, and that was the basis of his book, Nazm al-Mutawatir, which contains over 300 hadiths, which are, according to at least one scholar, considered mutawatir. So we see that there were scholars across the schools labeling hadiths as mutawatir. This is showing the Sunni schools, but even among the Shia, we have Shia scholars labeling hadith as mutawatir. And you see, particularly among the Malikis, this is very prominent, which is understandable given the connection to Amal, which we mentioned earlier.
So, Dr. Suheil, on the vertical axis, is this number of hadith being declared?
Number of, let me see.
So is it number of ahadith being declared mutawatir, or is it number of scholars that made the declaration?
Let me try to remember.
I believe this graph is in your upcoming book, correct?
Yes, inshallah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I don't quite remember. I think it is number of scholars in each generation, in each century. Number of scholars who label hadith, one or more hadith as mutawatir. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, Imam al-Suyuti is the first person we know of to compile a collection of exclusively mutawatir hadiths. His book contained 112. I just mentioned Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Kattani, whose book contained 310. In between those two, we have Salih ibn Mahdi al-Maqbali, who was his original training was Zaydi Shi'i, and then he started to read the Sunni books, and he ended up kind of in between. He embraced some Sunni views, and so he basically was practicing his own ijtihad, and so he retained some Zaydi's views, which is where he thought the evidence is stronger for that, but he embraced some Sunni views because of the what he felt was stronger evidence. So yeah, there is a story that once he was in when he was still in Yemen, he used to pray with qabd, with one hand over the other, and so some of the Zaydids called him Nasibi. And then when he went to Mecca, one time the Imam did sujood of tilawa in the salah, and according to Maqbali's ijtihad, which is also the Zaydi view, you should not do the sujood of the prostration of recitation if you recite this verse in the Quran. And so even though the Imam went down for sujood, he remained standing. When the salah was over, somebody came to him and said to him, "You are a shaitan because you did not do sujood." So he said, "In Yemen, I'm Nasibi. In Mecca, I am a shaitan. I can't win." Okay, in any case, Al-Maqbali compiled his own collection of Mutawātir hadiths, and his list contained 156. It is a small risala, al-Masabih fil al-Hadith al-Mutawātira, which is published in a collection of his writings. I think the collected volume is called Al-Abhath al-Musaddada. Okay. So as we can see, there is quite a lot of disagreement among the scholars of hadith as to how many hadith are actually mutawatir. And even if we get agreement that a particular hadith is mutawatir, that is not the end of the story, because even if a hadith is mutawatir, a given scholar might still not act on it. And I identified 5 reasons for 5 possible reasons why a given scholar might diverge from a mutawatir hadith. Number 1, abrogation. For example, many scholars that said that the hadiths about the necessity of making wudu after eating cooked food, these hadith are mutawatir. But this is abrogated, because there are also many hadith about the opposite, that you do not have to make wudu after eating cooked food. So if you can prove that a mutawatir hadith is abrogated, then you will not act on it. Number 2, amal or ijma'. So as we saw, a number of scholars like Ibn Hazm said that the hadith about raising the hands before and after ruku in salah are mutawatir, but the Hanafis do not act on that. Why? Because of amal. Because the wide widespread practice in Kufa was not to raise the hands before and after ruku. And so the Hanafis considered this to be stronger than the individually narrated hadith. And similarly, this is one argument within the Maliki school, although some Malikis dispute that, but at least some of the Malikis argue that sadl, to leave the hands by the sides when praying, was the amal of the people of Medina. And so that is stronger than the hadiths which are narrated about putting one hand over the other, folding the hands. As this is related to the strength of amal, which, as we said, is similar to Tawātur, as the Shaykh of Imam Malik, Shaykh Rabi'a, commented. He said to one of the hadith folk that you people of hadith transmit one person from one person from the Prophet, but the amal of the people of Medina is thousands of people transmitting from thousands of people in the previous generation, transmitting from thousands of people before them from the Prophet. But yeah, of course, these issues remained controversial within among the scholars. So you cannot decisively say that one position or the other is definitely invalid, at least from my point of view. Number 3, sometimes scholars leave aside a mutawatir hadith based on legal reasoning. For example, the Kharijis did not accept the hadith about rajm, stoning for married people who commit adultery, because they said it is, for example, contradicting the Quran and so on. But actually, are the hadith about rajm mutawatir or not? That itself is disputed, and from what I recollect, according to the majority, they are not mutawatir. Number 4, and yeah, similarly for number 3, you might find other examples where the Hanafis or Malikis, for example, leave aside particular hadith based on legal reasoning. For example, the hadith about al-qada bi shahidin wa yamin, about the judge issuing a verdict if there are not 2 witnesses, then based on 1 witness and oath, and numerous other issues which were, for example, listed by Ibn al-Qayyim in Alam al-Muwaqqi'in. Okay, number 4, theological reasoning. For example, the Mu'tazila did not accept the hadiths about intercession for people who had committed major sins and died without repenting from them. Again, you could debate whether the hadith are mutawatir or not, but even they are mutawatir. The Mu'tazili response here would be that this based on theological principles which are rational principles, which are stronger than individually transmitted hadiths. It does not make sense, according to the Mu'tazila, for someone who committed murder, for example, and died without repenting from it. It does not make sense for them to be forgiven. And so for the Mu'tazila, these hadiths about intercession have to either be rejected as contradicting common sense, or interpreted in some way. For example, I think Qadi Abdul Jabbar suggested that it means that the people who committed the major sin and then repented, they will benefit from the intercession of the Prophet for their repentance to be accepted. Okay. Whereas the Sunnis accepted this hadith at face value. So basically, according to the dominant Sunni opinion, there were only a handful of dissenters. Someone who died without repenting from a major sin will not be eternally in hellfire, whereas according to the Mu'tazilis, such a person would be eternally in hellfire. But according to the Sunnis, such a person, even if he is punished for some time in hellfire, eventually through intercession, he would be brought out and enter paradise. And finally, number 5, kashf, right? Kind of unveiling, spiritual unveiling. This is not that common, but for example, the Sufi mystic Ad-Dabbagh rejected the hadiths about splitting of the Prophet's chest based on kashf. In other words, he claimed that Allah kind of showed him through spiritual insight that these hadiths are not true, that this never happened. Okay, so I think this is last but one slide. So Tawātur is a powerful concept that underwent sophisticated elaboration and application at the hands of Muslim scholars. The seeds of this concept are from human intuition. As we said, even the Greek empiricist talks about it, and even before the Greek empiricist, I'm sure people were aware of this concept of corroboration. So, yeah, I guess the Greek empiricists sowed these seeds initially, and or you could say the rationalist Muslim theologians, the Kalam folk, sowed them, and then this plant was nurtured by diverse folk, theologians, legal theorists, usuliyin, philosophers, hadith folk, and others. And then this was harvested in service of the religious texts, Quran and Hadith. So as we saw, the Quran has been amazingly preserved, and the rasm, the texts of the Quran, at least the skeletal text, can very confidently be dated to Uthman's time. And the oral tradition is Mutawātir in a broad sense. But some of the finer details of the qira'at and words where the qira'at differ from each other, these finer details we cannot insist are mutawātir. But as you saw, this does not really affect the core beliefs and practices of Islam, and it is not, and therefore should not be considered problematic. Then Tawātur of hadiths. I think I alluded to this earlier. It is worth highlighting it again. Tawātur of hadiths is at a lower level than Tawātur of the Quran. So there's no hadith which is as widely transmitted as the Quran, which is why the scholars differed as to whether there are any mutawātir hadiths. And so most of the hadith, I think we could safely say that most of the hadith are not mutawātir, and then there are a smaller number of hadith which are considered mutawātir according to many scholars. But most of the hadith, if not all, they give us, provided they are sahih, they give us confidence rather than full certainty. Probabilistic knowledge is the term that Sheikh Musa Faber uses in his translation of the Waraqat. Probabilistic knowledge. A hadith ahad conveys dhan rajih, which is probabilistic knowledge, which is short of full certainty. Some people are troubled when they find this out, but you should not be troubled, because if we think about it, most of human knowledge is probabilistic. There's very little of our human knowledge, whether religious or not, which is absolutely certain. And we make decisions every day based on knowledge which is less than certain. If the doctor prescribes a medicine for you, is this certain? Is his diagnosis certain? No, probably not. Even if the diagnosis is certain, as it may well be in some cases, maybe many cases, is he certain that this medication will help you? No.
Yeah, the most important thing is to be justified in accepting, a certain claim, especially in the absence of any reasonable defeater. I mean, even when you're, even in a court of law, right? The lawyers are always telling the jury, in the absence of reasonable doubt, not just doubt, period, in the absence of reasonable doubt, you're supposed to reach a certain verdict, right? And so the same claim here, if there is no reasonable, there's no good reason to doubt a certain report when it's already been transmitted by people who are deemed to be trustworthy, then you are justified in accepting that report, especially if there are no factors that will call into question the reliability of of these reports. And I believe, and this could obviously extend to a further discussion that, even with these hadith, several scholars would still elevate it to the status of providing certain knowledge if there are certain qara'in or indicating factors that support the establishment of these hadith. So if you even if you have a hadith that are not backed by mutawatir isnads, but if, for example, they are accepted by the ummah, for example, as being established and as being correct in meaning, even if they are ahad, that kind of elevates the status and credibility of those ahadith. And so it goes back to that heap paradox, that you mentioned in the beginning. Sometimes you just know that this is something that is certain to accept, and in the absence of any reasonable doubt, in the absence of any reasonable, or as you said here, compelling reason to doubt this report, there is no justification. There's no epistemic justification to call it into question. So at the end of the day, are we justified to accept something? And I think that's the primary that's the primary question. And the concern is that with several Muslims, once they get accustomed to a certain epistemic standard, it becomes psychologically difficult at times to lower your standard, and at the same time still say you're reasonably confident in the veracity of what it is you're accepting. So we have a very high standard for the Quran, and then there are certain ahadith that are below that, but we're still very confident about their veracity. And then when we go a bit below that, people start to feel uneasy. Oh, why am I always lowering my standards? But at the end of the day, you could have a very broad range of standards whereby you are justified in accepting it. So the Quran will probably be at the very top, and then within that range, you may have Sahih Ahad Hadith where you're still justified to accept them, absent any compelling reason not to. And so it's just I guess how you frame it and how you want to approach it is what is essential. And I think for many they struggle with that, but once we think about this a little bit more carefully and get educated better about it, I think it's quite straightforward. Well, Barakallahu fikum, Dr. Suheil. I mean, this was a very educational. Oh, please, yeah.
We have a couple of points.
Absolutely.
Sort of on the slides, so I could quickly wrap up. So yeah, as Saad Bassam said, number one, we should have justifiable reason to accept something, which, if you look at the standard of the hadith scholars, if there is a Sahih hadith, and if you look at what the standards for that are, the rigorous standards, I would say that that is justification for accepting it. Again, as you said, in the absence of any indication to the contrary. So that is one point. And even if that is not full certainty, at least it is enough confidence to base action on. The next point on the slide, if something is coming only from a hadith, a person is not excommunicated for denying it. In other words, you cannot accuse the person of kufr, even if some or many scholars have claimed that hadith to be mutawātir. But you notice the emphasis on only from a hadith, because sometimes there's something mentioned in the hadith, but that is not the sole basis for it. For example, the number of prayers in a day, number of prayers in a day and number of rakahs of each prayer. There are some hadith about this, but it would be difficult to claim that all these narrations are mutawātir. And even if a particular scholar has said that they are mutawātir, as we said, mutawātir in hadith is lower than mutawātir of the Quran. But in this case, this information is not coming only from the hadith. It is coming off also from the mutawātir amal, mutawātir consecutive intergenerational practice. And so if someone denies that the number of prayers in a day is 5, or that Fajr is 2 rakah, the theologians would indeed pronounce kufr on that person. So if something is coming only from a hadith, we should be hold back from regarding someone as kafir for denying it. But as we saw, sometimes there's something in a hadith, but the same information might also be attested in the Quran or in Mutawātir amal. But in any case, to pronounce kufr is not the concern of the average Muslim. It is the concern of the scholars, and there are very rigorous standards for this. And finally, there are, in spite of this controversy over Mutawātir hadiths, and in spite of the fact that even if we say there are Mutawātir hadiths, as many scholars have, the level of Tawātur in hadith is epistemically lower than the Tawātur of the Quran and the Amal. Nevertheless, there are a good number of hadiths for which there is a huge number of isnads. Actually, I maybe should have brought some examples. Dr. Ahmad Hashim actually has shared with me his isnad diagram of the hadiths about unzil al-Qur'anu ala sab'ati ahruf. And if you look at that diagram, it is mind-boggling how many isnads there are. Similarly, if you look at the hadiths about wiping on the khufs, many hadiths. So it would be unwise to deny the historicity of things like this without a compelling basis. And actually, even for example, the Masah al-Khufain, most of the non-Sunni schools do not accept this. And even among the Sunnis, there was some disagreement, but even the dissenters, those who say that it is not valid to wipe on the khufs, they do not deny that the Prophet did this. But typically they claim that this was abrogated by the verse of the Quran. So they're not denying the historicity of this. They are departing from the Mutawātir based on legal reasoning. So, yeah, so of course the Sunnis claim that the verse of the Quran is not abrogating this, and they cite some evidence to support this. So yeah, I mean, I practice al-masah myself, but definitely I'm convinced that it is not a matter of iman and kufr. You cannot accuse someone of kufr if he does not accept this practice. Okay, and that is all I have.
Okay, great. Barakallahu fikum, Dr. Suheil. This was a very educational and informative presentation, and I think it put a lot of things into perspective when it comes to this subject. And I don't think your presentation is only relevant for students of knowledge, but the average religious layperson, religious Muslim layperson as well. This is because many Muslims like to take pride in the fact that the Quran and Sahih Hadith are preserved, and they often contrast Islam with religions such as Christianity when it comes to the preservation of religious scriptures. And when doing so, the notion of Tawātur is frequently brought up. So this presentation will prove very useful for many lay Muslims as well. So thank you once again for this very valuable contribution. I just have one question before I let you go. In light of your presentation, what advice would you give to students of knowledge who would like to better understand the notion of Tawātur according to different Islamic disciplines? Are there any notable works that you'd recommend? It could be classical or contemporary.
Thank you. And before that, thank you for that comment. And I definitely strongly agree. So actually, often you find people who are having a crisis of faith based on some obscure hadith. So no need for crisis of faith. Simply leave aside that hadith, and you can still be a Muslim. Say Allah knows best. Maybe this hadith is there's a mistake made by one of the narrators. Maybe has a context. No need to leave Islam based on a problem you have with one particular hadith. Okay, and then your question about books, yes. So in Arabic, I think one of the best books I have found is by Mullah Khatir, I think Abdul Rahman Mullah Khatir. I don't remember the exact title of the book. And then in English, there is a recent English translation of the Azhar al-Mutanathira, which is Suyuti's compilation of Mutawātir hadiths. So that could be useful to get an idea of some of the hadiths which might fall into this category, although a number of the examples Suyuti included here were later questioned and disputed by other scholars. But there are many of the hadith which are not that controversial also. So that is one book in English. And I made reference to my own book on Tawātur, which inshallah is under contract with Edinburgh University Press, which will probably be published sometime next year.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for it, inshallah ta'ala. And I want to thank you again for this very informative educational presentation. And any final words before we end this recording?
No, thank you for suggesting this to me, and thank you for hosting me, and thank you for your helpful comments and clarifications. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from you and from all of us.
Barakallahu fikum, Doctor. And with that, I'm going to part you and our listeners with the Islamic readings of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi